Ecofictologists, welcome back to my channel. My name is Lovis and today I want to start a little mini-series talking all about conservation in ecofiction. This is something that's very close to my heart and I wanted to dedicate a good amount of time to it and look at it from various different angles, so please forgive me if I get carried away. We have touched on the topic before when I reviewed Trails in the Sand by P.C. Tick and Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver, books that I very much enjoyed, but we by no means covered all there is to talk about. Just a bit of an insight into my experience with conservation work. I worked with two conservation organizations, one in Honduras and one in the Philippines. My bachelor's thesis had a strong conservation focus, and my current PhD work will hopefully be able to be applied to conservation questions as well as sustainable fishing questions. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and it's something that I look for in the books that I read, and most likely something that will feature quite heavily in the writing that I do when I do it. I've been talking a lot about how ecofiction can act as a catalyst for behavioral change, and I do truly believe that. I think a lot of emphasis is put on the climate crisis in ecofiction. It makes up a large portion of the genre, which is so important. But another aspect that I think is equally as important, but is maybe less explored, is that of conservation. This kind of ecofiction highlights an aspect of anthropogenic change that we have a good chance of influencing. I think it is easier to turn the tide on things like wildlife trafficking than on some aspects of climate change. And we don't have the excuse of needing to wait for technological advancement to do so. This one's on us. The field of conservation is one that doesn't show up enough in the media, in my opinion, either about success stories or about the decline and the loss. And I think most people are unaware of the realities of conservation work. It is immensely complicated. Balancing the needs of the animal or the area that you are trying to protect with the needs of the people who are sharing the resources or directly exploiting the species that you're focusing on, and then throw into the mix the political and economic aspect of trying to find a compromise, and it's just ridiculous. The thing that I've seen over and over again when working with conservation organizations is that you have to be able to see the situation from multiple points of view. You can't just sit there and repeat, I'm right, you're wrong, you have to change, because you're not going to get anywhere. The skill, this talent to listen to what people need and what drives the actions that they take is really so important. If you don't understand all the parts of the equation, then you're fighting with a handicap. You can be so much more effective if you understand all of the players. On top of that, if you really understand all of the perspectives, then you can build better relationships, which makes a world of difference when you're working on the ground. The work is hard enough without other parties working against you as well. This idea of seeing a situation from multiple perspectives, each with their own motivation and goals, is something that we see in fiction all the time. Very often, a story is told from multiple points of view, and it usually, if done well, makes the story more interesting and complex, and it draws you in, especially when you can actually relate to each of the characters and understand their motivations. I feel like there are so many conservation stories that need to be told to highlight the amazing ongoing work, but also draw attention to the work that still needs to be done. Because most people live in cities, we can get very removed from wildlife, and the dire nature of the situation is kind of lost on us because we have nothing to connect it to. Lions just become pictures on the telly, or photos in a photo contest, or seen behind the fence of a too small enclosure in the zoo. They're not real in the way that they would be if we saw them in the wild, in their natural habitat, where wildlife can just blow you away with its beauty and majesty, and you create a real emotional bond. But I think fiction can make them real, can give people this emotional connection to hold on to, so that they feel something the next time they hear a statistic about another species on the brink of extinction. We have developed an amazing ability to disconnect what we want nature to give us from the intrinsic value that nature has. That seashell trinket that you bought on your last trip to the Bahamas? probably far too small to be harvested, meaning it hasn't mated and contributed anything to the population, meaning that industry is unsustainable. But the shells are so pretty! So you look at the shell and not the wider ecosystem behind it. And you're not alone. An entire industry is based on the fact that you want that seashell. And it isn't entirely your fault, because it's not like that information is written in the store when you're buying it. And this kind of stuff doesn't really make it into the media, so how would you know? Same with those wildlife interactions that you can do on holiday, that if you were really honest with yourself, you know are destructive and can't be good for the animals, but you really want to swim with that dolphin or you really want to ride that elephant, so you disconnect from the wider view of the ecosystem. These are the connections that I think ecofiction can strengthen. The power of fiction is to create empathy, which is exactly what we need in order to make more conscious choices about how we interact with the environment. Things that are actually under our control. So I started doing some research, and I was actually pleasantly surprised at how much support and effort there is to champion storytelling in conservation. There really is this emphasis on effective communication and recognition that an audience responds best to a story where they can invest in the characters and absorb information that is conveyed in a digestible format. The focus at the moment isn't really on fiction as much as non-fiction, telling the stories of real people and real events, but telling them in a captivating way. But I found a blog post on the Global Giving website that was outlining how to talk about your conservation work in a way to make donors happy, and to my astonishment, it looked a lot like the writing advice that I see people getting on how to make readers connect with your story. Set the scene and introduce your character. This could be someone affected by your conservation work. Let people connect with your protagonist. Describe the barriers that facing your character. This is the conflict of your story. Get people invested in your protagonist so that they're rooting for them to succeed. How did you solve your character's problem? Your audience is already invested, so what happened? Go beyond actions. This is the resolution of your plot and of your character arc. What could your character do now that they couldn't do before? How has your protagonist's life changed due to the conservation work? And finally, get your audience involved. Ask them to take a specific action. There are a lot of strong similarities there, which just goes to show how integral storytelling is to the success and support of conservation work. And I really wanted to explore what kind of impact ecofiction focusing on conservation could have. When I search for conservation fiction, I find loads of books on art conservation. Books, paintings, artifacts, etc. It is more common to find and for people to search for books on conservation of art than on conservation of wildlife. This could be a product of authors or publishers not wanting to market their books as having to do with conservation, and that makes me really sad because I think that stems from a misunderstanding of what conservation stories can be. Readers might think that they're depressing and disheartening and only written to make them feel guilty because that's all they see in the media. But what they might not know is that they can be empowering, inspiring, emotional roller coasters, and of course educational. Where I did find a strong wildlife conservation contingent is in the mystery, crime, thriller genres. I mean, wildlife trafficking is basically made for those genres. And it's easy to see why. Those are very dangerous situations, especially if you are a conservationist trying to get between a poacher and his payoff. That is a very dangerous place to be. So you have ready-made suspense and investment from the reader. These are huge problems for endangered animals, and it's great that they're getting this attention. It was encouraging to see authors in these genres use them as a way to talk about the complexities and often the dangers of conservation work. But still, even with those, my list of books focusing on wildlife conservation is not very long, so I would love for you to share any titles that you have come across in your reading that highlights this. I have created a list on Goodreads for this because the only other relevant one I could find was called Action Heroes That Fight Against Wildlife Crime, which is where I found several of the books that I mentioned, but it's a little too narrow and I'm looking a little bit broader than just wildlife crime. So please feel free to add any books that you think fit that description to that list. I will leave the link to it down below. So I hope that wasn't too ranty. I do tend to get a bit carried away when I talk about conservation. This is an area of ecofiction that I would love to see get more attention. and it's something that I very much plan to contribute to myself eventually when I finish my PhD. I'll keep you posted. So that's all from me today. So go forth and find some lovely titles to add to my list, and but not before subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell so you get notified every time I upload new content. Just a little teaser, next week I've got something very exciting happening, and I will see you then, Ecofictologists.